Hello everyone, first news update for 1st of October. Now it's 10 o'clock in the morning Moscow time, and I have prepared quite a number of news on some major developments, and hopefully you will find it informative and interesting, and if so, please like the video and leave some commentary. This might help to deal with the algorithm and reach wider audience. I will just remind you, dear friends, before I go through some news, that first news updates are published initially on my Patreon and Boosty pages and for early access. And if you want to support my work, please consider to join our communities on Patreon or Boosty. Links are on this video description box and in the pinned comment. And also, let me remind you that this evening, 10 p.m. Moscow time, I will launch a live stream with second news update. Please join if you can. That's been said, dear friends, let's go through some news, and I will try to make this update as shorter as possible. And so first report is from TASS News Agency about work of Russian air defense systems overnight. According to TASS News Agency, which is agency's report, which is based on Defense Ministry, 20 drones were intercepted over the several Russian regions overnight by air defense systems on duty. I can give you some specifics on that. 8 drones were intercepted over the Belgorod region, 8 over the Rostov region, 3 drones over the Saratov region, and 1 drone over the Voronezh region. At this point, there are no reports about casualties or more or less significant damage on the ground. If any update on that, I will share additional information during the second update this evening during the live stream. Also, TASS News Agency is reporting, based on Defense Ministry, that Russian armed forces liberated Seversk Mali settlement in the DPR. I mentioned this report yesterday during the live stream. Settlement is located in between Seversk and Liman, yet again, northern sector of the DPR. In addition to that, TASS News Agency is reporting that Russian armed forces almost completely liberated the settlement of Verbovo. According to reports, Kiev regime's forces were drawing out of the settlement, and clearing operation is underway right now. Overall, dear friends, RIA Novosti's calculation is telling us that Russian armed forces in September liberated 19 settlements in the zone of special military operation. This information is based on the confirmations of Russian Defense Ministry. I can give you some specifics on that. Largest number of settlements, according to RIA Novosti, liberated in Dnipropetrovsk and region and the Donetsk People's Republic, 8 each. In Dnipropetrovsk region, Russian armed forces established control over their Novoselovka, Хорошая, Sosnovka, Novopetrovska, Novonikolaevka, Biryozovoe, Kalinovskaya, and Stepovaya. In Donetsk People's Republic, Russian armed forces liberated Fyodorovka, Markova, Muravka, Peryezdnaya, Mayskaya, Shandrigolova, and Kirovsk. Also, in addition to that, Russian armed forces established control over their Olgovsk and Novoivanovka in Zaporozhye region and Yunakovka in Sumy region. Don't tell this news, dear friends, to people that only receive information from Western so-called media, because they will be surprised big time, because all Western so-called media does is claiming that either Russia is losing or there is no movement on the line of contact. It's a stalemate, and Russia is not managing to achieve any success, which is a false narrative, of course, that Western propaganda is pushing. In addition to this report, we have update on developments on the northern flank of Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. According to reports, Russian armed forces regain initiative in a breakthrough area. Kiev regime did try hard, send a lot of its reserves to stop Russian advances in a breakthrough area. They send even neo-Nazi Azov brigade in this direction, and according to report, Russian armed forces destroy these reserves that Kiev regime sent in this direction and reclaim initiative and continue to further advance in this area. Pokrovsk-Mirnograd basically is in operational encirclement, and I did spoke about it during the yesterday's live stream too. TASS News Agency reporting that Russian armed forces have established fire control over the logistics lines of Kiev regime's forces in Seversk, which is not surprising, as I already said, dear friends, after finalizing clearing operation in forestry area on the north of Seversk, Syrianka forestry, Russian troops already entered their Yampol settlement and liberated settlement of Mali, Seversk, Mali. I did mention this in the beginning. Both these settlements are located in between Seversk and Liman, and obviously now Russian troops have fire control on supply and support lines that Kiev regime is using to assist their garrison in Seversk. My prediction is that before end of maybe even October, Russian troops will establish control over the Seversk, all the surrounding settlements, including Yampol and potentially even Liman, because Russian armed forces advancing towards the Liman, not just from northern eastern direction now, but also from northern western direction. That's been said, dear friends. Another report from RIA Novosti that Ukrainian armed forces in the Kharkov region are refusing to go to their front lines in mass. Quite interesting stuff there. So militants from the 22nd Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces near the village of Grigorievka in the Kharkov region are refusing to move to their positions in mass. Military police have been called in, according to Russian security forces. Interesting report, dear friends. As situation for Kiev regime and its NATO backers deteriorates on line of contact, of course, we're going to receive more and more information about refusal of Kiev regime's militants to obey orders and go to the front line. Also, dear friends, of course, this Ukrainian crisis and the proxy war, basically, that West is waging against Russia is making headlines all over the Western world, and day in, day out, Western so-called public figures, politicians, current or past officials, high-ranking officials are making statements. And well, let me give you statements from former UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, who in Warsaw was a security forum yesterday come up with some genocidal calls, not surprising, from British elites. They proved for centuries that they are genocidal maniacs, right? The so-called elites in UK, British aristocracy and whatever puppets they use in political system there. But what Ben Wallace said openly was still quite something. I mean, to talk about genocide this openly, this publicly, I mean, this is next level of degeneration, of course. Let's listen what Ben Wallace had to say.
I think what we have to remember is what motivates Putin. Putin is in love with the idea of dominating Ukraine, taking Ukraine. Crimea is Russia and Russia is Crimea, he announced in 2014. If you read his speeches of 2014, he compares Crimea to the Holy Mount. So we have to help Ukraine have the long-range capabilities to make Crimea unviable. We need to choke the life out of Crimea. And I think if we do that, I think Putin will realize he's got something to lose. If it is not inhabitable or not possible for it to function, and that bridge, we need Taurus in from Germany, we need to smash the cursed bridge, because that's an ego, that's a statue to Putin's ego. And I think if we do that, Putin will suddenly realize he's got something to lose.
Wow. What can I say, dear friends? Ben Wallace went to say publicly that he is in support of genocide of millions of people in Crimea. He is in support of terrorism, terrorist attacks, not just on civilians, but also on civilian infrastructure, that Crimean bridges, for example. In normal country, for this kind of statements, Ben Wallace, former Defense Secretary of UK, would be arrested and put in jail potentially for many years, but not in Poland. That is run by extreme Russophobes. So in Poland and in the NATO countries, basically, any any criminal act against Russia goes. This is absolutely insane, by the way. Probably Moscow will react on these statements because Ben Wallace is a still active member of UK's political class, public, and you cannot allow these kind of statements to go unnoticed. This is truly insane. Share your take, dear friends, what you think. But when I was listening to this video first time, I was kind of shocked. Even though, by the way, we are talking about British so-called elites, which is famous for being absolutely inhuman, as British aristocracy is, historically speaking, and they are used to killing millions. In past, at least they were not bragging about publicly, and now they do. How insane is that, man? And that's the creatures that we are dealing with, man. I refuse to call this element a human being, because he is not. This genocidal maniac is not a human. This is a rabid animal, man. That's what it is. Openly calling for extermination of millions of civilians. That's a whole new level of degeneration of a Western political class. Let's continue with some other news, dear friends, that I have prepared for you. And well, as I said, Western so-called elites, out of desperation, out of their tremendous degeneration, are day-on-day basis threatening Russia. And we just listened to Ben Wallace, former UK Defense Secretary. Let me give you some statements from Finnish president, current president Stubb, who literally, like every other day, makes some threatening statements towards Russia, which is insane. And if anything, Finnish society should be not just shamed of their own elites, but also wary, because you never know what these criminals that are in charge of Finland and other Western countries gonna provoke today, tomorrow, day after. So Politico reported that according to Alexander Stubb, Finnish president, Trump will now wield his stick to punish Putin. Well, and they are focused on Putin always, isn't it? They love to talk about, Putin, while in reality they mean Russia, they mean Russians. So Politico is claiming that according to Stubb, Trump has shifted from a carrot policy to a big stick approach towards Russia. So Stubb claims that the US is increasing support for Ukraine. Experience has shown that carrots rarely work on Russia. Persuasions and carrots rarely work on Russia. Now comes the stage of the stick, Stubb said in a conversation with the Politico and the other media in Helsinki. The only question is how big that stick will be, he said. When asked what kind of stick Trump would use against Putin, yet again, Putin, I mean, they are bombing Russia and killing Russians. But yet again, to brainwash public in the West, to create this fake pain that, you know what, we are not xenophobes, we are not animals, we are not killing civilians, we are not about genocide, but we just attacking Putin, which is a false narrative. Putin is as safe as anyone can be, by the way, right? But that's the narrative, and one of the ways how Western so-called elites are brainwashing the public in the West, and unfortunately quite successfully. But anyways, let's continue. When asked what kind of stick Trump would use against Putin, the Finnish president jokingly replied, maybe it will be a golf club. President Trump works, if not around the clock, then every day to end the war. He has 14 clubs in his bag. Possible measures include tightening sanctions, including secondary ones, rising tariffs, and even more active use of American weapons capable of striking targets deep within the Russian territory, the Finnish president asserts. And yet again, dear friends, on a literally daily basis, we have more and more indicators that big provocation is about to be launched by NATO against Russia, after which Moscow will have no choice but to retaliate, and retaliate with such a force and scale that Western so-called elites will have no option but to face the reality, acknowledge that they lost this proxy war against Russia, and to capitulate. That's how it's gonna be. Vzglyad newspaper is also reporting that draft resolution to seize Russian frozen assets has been introduced to U.S. Senate. What a surprise. A draft resolution has been introduced to U.S. Senate that calls for the seizure of frozen Russian assets and their transfer to Ukraine in monthly tranches. The document proposes that the executive branch of the government and the leaders of the G7 and the European Union seize Russia's sovereign assets. The draft resolution also calls for transferring them to Ukraine in tranches of at least $10 billion monthly. The bill was sponsored by Senator John Kennedy and supported by Senators Richard Blumenthal, Lindsey Graham, who is on the Russian list of terrorists and extremists, by the way, and Sheldon Whitehouse. The document has now been submitted to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for consideration. The next of the resolution has not yet been, the text of the resolution not yet been officially published. It's only a matter of time, dear friends. I have said many times before, it's only a matter of time when collective West will formalize stealing of the frozen Russian assets. And once they will do it officially, then I think Moscow will retaliate and confiscate similar volume of Western investments in Russian territory. And these investments are higher than $300 billion that West frozen in their jurisdiction when it comes to Russian investments there. But if anyone was thinking that, eventually collective West will give these assets to Russia, give these investments to Russia to save the face and somehow save their financial and banking system, extremely weaponized Western financial and banking system, no, man. That kind of approach is wrong. Of course, Western is going to steal these assets, of course. Let's continue with some other news. And while U.S. officials are discussing how to steal Russian investments, Russian assets, U.S. government went on a shutdown. So the U.S. federal government has shut down for the first time in almost 7 years after Republicans and Democrats failed to agree on a spending bill in their Senate. Their deadline to approve their funds for running the government expired on Wednesday, as both parties rejected each other's spending plans in a back-to-back votes. Okay, U.S. government went on a shutdown. Let's see how long this shutdown will last, day, 2, or maybe even a couple of weeks. Also, yesterday, dear friends, I mentioned in the second live stream, in second update, that U.S. redeploying a large number of KS-135 Stratotanker and KS-46 Pegasus refueling aircrafts, along with the fighter jets to the Middle East. Some have already landed at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Dozens more tankers and the fighters are waiting at the bases in the UK and I guess elsewhere too, to be transferred to Middle East. And last time we see this kind of activity was right before US launched their strikes on Iran some 3 months ago. And this redeployment of these significant forces in direction of in Middle East might also be indicator that globalists, neocons, and their Zionist allies are about to launch next phase of escalation in the Middle East in attempt to provoke regional war, shut down navigation in the Persian Gulf, and cut off China and the global South in general from Middle Eastern energy sources. I spoke about this stuff many times before. I think there is no need to repeat, but also, dear friends, because it's a Middle East and because we are observing extreme level of tensions between collective West and Russia, I would not be surprised at all if Pentagon has plans to strike on Russian bases in Syria. we should keep in mind that Russia has military bases in Syria still to nowadays, and maybe during the next phase of escalation that NATO will launch against Russia in a short time, they will attack Russian bases in Syria too. Should not be excluded such a risk, and should be taken in account. And I think Russian militarism, Russian political leadership is taking in account all possible risks that can be and most likely will be generated by a ruling class of the West. Also, dear friends, interesting report from Yemen, Ansar Allah movement, or Houthi rebels as they also are known, stated that they are imposing sanctions on 13 American energy companies, including ExxonMobil and Chevron. This decision effectively ends the so-called truce that was reached between Houthis and Trump's administration. So let's see what is going to happen after that. But I guess U.S. Energy companies, U.S. companies in general, that were moving goods in and out of Red Sea and Arabian Sea, gonna have some issues now after this decision of Houthis. Maybe we will also see U.S. sending back some strike groups in Red Sea to attack Ansar Allah movement again, also a possibility. And maybe this redeployment of forces of U.S. in the Middle East is related to potential assault on Yemen. Also can be the case. TASS news agency is also reporting that, well, unfortunately, as a result of strong earthquake in Philippines, according to some reports, it was a 6.7, 6.9 magnitude earthquake. 60 people were killed, dozens more wounded, and their numbers are constantly changing. Tragedy has struck the Philippines. RIA Novosti is also reporting that, according to media, White House is seeking the removal of Venezuelan president from power. Members of the U.S. President Donald Trump's administration, led by Secretary of the State Marco Rubio, are seeking to oust of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and are discussing increasingly military pressure to achieve their goals. New York Times reports citing U.S. officials, and of course, this news is not coming as a surprise, because for what other reason U.S. would deploy its strike force off coast of Venezuela, other than to conduct a decapitation strike on Venezuela and to try to do some regime change there and recolonize basically this Bolivarian republic. So therefore, of course, this report is not really surprising, and the Venezuelan government knows what is being planned, what is going to happen, and that's why I think Venezuela's President Maduro signed a decree granting security power in a case of war to Vice President Rodriguez, who will be able to mobilize the armed forces in case he will have to take charge. And I think more steps are needed on part of Maduro's government. They have to designate first 10 individuals already that will replace each other in case of decapitation strikes that U.S. is quite good at, right? Take a look at the history of as military operations or invasions of the U.S. into other countries, or the collective West in general. They always go after leadership of those countries, and I don't think Venezuela is going to be exception. Also, dear friends, while U.S. is escalating with Venezuela too, we have this report that National Assembly of this Bolivarian Republic ratified their treaty on strategic partnership and cooperation with the Russian Federation. This was reported by Russian ambassador to Caracas, Sergei Melik Bagdasarov. And even though details are not known, I wonder if in this agreement there is a military element also, like Russia signing with North Korea. If in this agreement there is a mutual military assistance or mutual military defense agreement, then in that case, of course, once all the formal steps are taken and the agreement is in full force, agreement is implemented, Moscow will have every legal means to provide whatever security assistance Venezuela will need in case of assault from US or any other country. But yet again, for this moment, I did not see any reports on the matter if this agreement includes a mutual protection act also. And this is it for this relatively shorter news segment, dear friends. I hope you find it informative and useful, and if so, please click that like button, leave some commentary. This might help to deal with the algorithm and reach wider audience. If you like my work, if you want to support, you can do it through several means. Links are on this video in description box and in the pinned comment, including links to my Patreon and Boosty channels where these first updates are published initially. Also to PayPal platform. That's been said, dear friends, I will end this episode on that. Before I go, let me just remind you that 10 p.m. this evening, Moscow time, I will launch a live stream with the second news update, all the main topics that Russian media and public will pay attention to during the day. And I hope you will join the live stream. I hope you will join the communication, or how should I say, conversation. Yes. This is it for now. Have a wonderful day and take care. Bye for now.